The morning sun cast a gentle glow over the quiet residential street in Manchester as Prince William and Princess Kate stepped out of their modest black car. Unlike their usual royal engagements with grand ceremonies and red carpets, today felt different. There were no crowds of photographers, no elaborate security details blocking off entire streets, and no formal protocol officers briefing them on every handshake and conversation. Instead, the couple had chosen to make an unannounced visit to a small community that had been struggling through one of the most challenging periods in recent memory. The neighborhood they entered was far from the glittering palaces and manicured gardens of their royal residences. Rows of terraced houses lined the street, some with peeling paint, and small front gardens where children's toys lay scattered on the grass. This was Brookfield Estate, a working-class community that had been hit particularly hard by recent economic challenges. Many families here were dealing with job losses, rising costs of living, and the stress of trying to make ends meet while maintaining their dignity and hope for the future. As William and Kate walked down the street, they noticed the quiet that seemed to hang in the air. Unlike the bustling energy that usually characterized such neighborhoods, there was a subdued atmosphere. A few residents peered out from behind curtains, curious about the unfamiliar visitors but not yet recognizing the famous faces walking past their homes. The couple had deliberately chosen to dress casually, hoping to blend in and connect with people on a more personal level than their formal royal duties typically allowed. Their destination was number 47, a small house with a red door and a tiny front garden where a single rose bush struggled to bloom despite the challenging conditions. This was the home of Margaret Thompson, a 73-year-old widow who had become something of a local legend in the community. Despite her own limited means, Margaret had spent the past 18 months organizing food drives, collecting donations, and personally delivering meals to families who were struggling to feed their children. Margaret had no idea that her countless acts of kindness had caught the attention of people far beyond her neighborhood. A local social worker had written to several charities about Margaret's extraordinary efforts, and, eventually, word had reached the royal household. When William and Kate learned about this remarkable woman who was quietly changing lives in her community, they knew they had to meet her personally. The couple approached the red door with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This wasn't about ribbon-cutting ceremonies or formal speeches. This was about genuine human connection and acknowledging the kind of everyday heroism that often goes unnoticed in a world focused on celebrity and grand gestures. William raised his hand and knocked gently on the door, while Kate adjusted the simple bouquet of flowers they had picked up from a local shop on their way. Inside the house, Margaret was preparing for what she thought would be another ordinary day. She had just finished making sandwiches for her weekly delivery rounds to elderly neighbors who had difficulty getting to the shops. Her small kitchen table was covered with carefully wrapped packages, each labeled with a name and containing not just food, but also handwritten notes of encouragement and support. Margaret believed that nourishing the soul was just as important as feeding the body, so every package included a personal message reminding the recipient that they were valued and not forgotten. When the knock came at her door, Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and shuffled to answer it, expecting perhaps a neighbor or the postman. She certainly wasn't prepared for the sight that greeted her when she opened the door. Standing on her doorstep were two people she recognized immediately from television and newspapers, but seeing them in person on her own front step left her momentarily speechless. William smiled warmly and spoke first, his voice gentle and genuine. "Good morning, Margaret. I'm William, and this is Catherine. We've heard about the incredible work you're doing in your community, and we wanted to come and say thank you personally." Kate stepped forward and offered the flowers, adding, "We hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced. We wanted to meet the woman who has been making such a difference in so many lives." Margaret stood frozen for a moment, her mind trying to process what was happening. Then, with the same natural warmth that had endeared her to everyone in the neighborhood, she broke into a smile and invited them in. "Well, I never," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Please come in, come in. I'll put the kettle on. Though I must warn you, it's nothing fancy in here." As they entered Margaret's modest living room, William and Kate were struck by the warmth and love that filled the space. The furniture was old, but well-maintained, and every surface displayed photographs of family members, thank you card from grateful neighbors, and small mementos that clearly held precious memories. The walls were covered with children's drawings that had been given to Margaret by local families, each one a testament to the impact she had made on young lives. Kate noticed a corner of the room that had been converted into a small storage area for the community work. Boxes of tinned goods were neatly stacked alongside packages of pasta, rice, and other non-perishable items. Hand-knitted scarves and hats hung from hooks, ready to be distributed when the weather turned cold. It was clear that Margaret had turned her entire home into a base of operations for helping others, sacrificing her own comfort and space for the benefit of her community. Margaret busied herself making tea, her hands shaking slightly with nervous excitement. As she moved around her small kitchen, she began to share her story with her unexpected visitors. She explained how she had lost her husband 2 years ago and found herself feeling lost and purposeless. The grief had been overwhelming, and she had struggled to find meaning in her days. It was during this difficult period that she began to notice other people in her community who were also struggling, though for different reasons. The turning point had come when Margaret discovered that a family 3 houses down hadn't eaten a proper meal in days because the father had lost his job, and they were too proud to ask for help. Margaret had quietly prepared a large pot of soup and delivered it to their door with a note saying it was from a neighbor who cared. The relief and gratitude in that family's eyes had touched something deep within Margaret's heart and given her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since her husband's death. From that single act of kindness, Margaret's informal community support network had grown organically. She began paying attention to who in the neighborhood might need help, whether it was an elderly person who couldn't get to the shops, a single mother struggling to feed her children, or a family dealing with unexpected medical bills. Margaret approached each situation with sensitivity and discretion, always ensuring that people's dignity was preserved while their basic needs were met. As Margaret told her story, William and Kate listened with genuine interest and growing admiration. They asked questions about specific challenges she had encountered and how she had overcome them. They wanted to understand not just what she was doing, but why she continued to give so much of herself when she had so little to spare. Margaret's answers revealed a philosophy of life that was both simple and profound. She believed that everyone deserved to feel valued and supported, especially during difficult times. The conversation naturally turned to the broader issues affecting the community. Margaret spoke about families who were working full-time jobs, but still couldn't afford basic necessities, elderly people who were choosing between heating their homes and buying food, and children who were going to school hungry because their parents were too ashamed to ask for help. She painted a picture of a community that was resilient and proud, but also struggling with challenges that seemed to be growing more difficult each year. William and Kate were particularly moved by Margaret's stories about the children in the neighborhood. She described how she had started a small after-school program in her living room, offering homework help and snacks to kids whose parents were working multiple jobs to make ends meet. The program had grown from helping 2 or 3 children to accommodating nearly a dozen on any given afternoon. Margaret's home had become a safe haven where children could count on finding warmth, encouragement, and someone who cared about their success. As the morning progressed, other neighbors began to learn about the royal visit. Word spread quickly through the small community, and soon people were gathering outside Margaret's house, not to gawk or seek attention, but to share their own stories about how Margaret had touched their lives. William and Kate found themselves drawn into conversations with a diverse group of people, each with their own story of struggle and resilience. One young mother, Sarah, approached Kate with tears in her eyes. She explained how Margaret had appeared at her door during one of the darkest periods of her life, when she was battling depression after losing her job and struggling to care for her 2 young children alone. Margaret hadn't just brought food. She had brought hope, companionship, and practical support that had helped Sarah get back on her feet. "She saved my life," Sarah said simply, her voice breaking with emotion. An elderly man named Frank shared how Margaret had been checking on him daily since his wife had been hospitalized with a serious illness. She had not only helped with grocery shopping and meal preparation, but had also provided emotional support during his loneliest moments. Frank's weathered face showed the strain of worry and fear, but his eyes lit up when he spoke about Margaret's kindness and the difference it had made in his ability to cope with his wife's illness. William found himself in deep conversation with a teenager named Marcus, who credited Margaret with helping him stay focused on his education despite the chaos in his home life. Marcus explained how Margaret's after-school program had provided him with a quiet place to study and someone who believed in his potential when few others did. With Margaret's encouragement and support, Marcus had improved his grades and was now planning to attend university, something that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. These personal stories created a powerful picture of how one person's compassion and dedication could ripple through an entire community, creating positive change that extended far beyond the immediate recipients of help. William and Kate began to understand that Margaret's impact wasn't just about the food she distributed or the practical support she provided. She was creating connections, building hope, and helping people believe in their own worth and potential. The couple spent the entire morning in the neighborhood, moving from house to house and listening to story after story of Margaret's influence. They met families who had been helped through crisis situations, elderly people who had found companionship and support, and young people who had discovered new possibilities for their futures. Each conversation added another layer to their understanding of how community support could transform lives in profound and lasting ways. As lunchtime approached, Margaret insisted on preparing a simple meal for her royal guests. She made sandwiches from the same ingredients she used for her community deliveries, served with tea in her best china cups. The meal was humble, but prepared with love, and William and Kate later said it was one of the most meaningful meals they had ever shared. They sat around Margaret's small kitchen table, continuing their conversations about community, service, and the power of individual action to create positive change. During lunch, Kate asked Margaret about her own needs and whether anyone was taking care of her while she devoted so much energy to helping others. Margaret smiled and explained that the joy she found in serving her community was actually what sustained her. She said that helping others had given her life new meaning after her husband's death, and that the relationships she had built through her service had become like a new family for her. This response deeply moved both William and Kate, who recognized in Margaret a pure example of selfless service that aligned with their own values and the principles they hoped to embody in their royal roles. They began to discuss ways that Margaret's approach to community support might be supported or replicated in other areas, exploring how her grassroots methods might be scaled up while maintaining their personal, dignified character. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that this visit was becoming something much more significant than anyone had anticipated. The genuine connections being formed and the stories being shared were creating a moment of authentic human encounter that transcended the usual boundaries between royalty and commoners. William and Kate weren't just fulfilling a royal duty. They were experiencing a profound lesson in service, compassion, and community that would stay with them long after they returned to their official responsibilities. The impact on the community was equally profound. Residents who had been struggling with feelings of isolation and hopelessness found themselves part of something larger, connected not just to Margaret, but to each other and to the broader society that their royal visitors represented. The visit was creating a sense of validation and recognition that their struggles mattered and their efforts to support each other were valued and important. Hashtag Prince William and Princess Kate's simple act sparks nationwide tears. Part 2, the afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across Brookfield Estate when William and Kate made a decision that would transform their visit from a private gesture into something much more powerful. After spending hours listening to the residents share their stories about Margaret's impact on their lives, the royal couple realized they were witnessing something extraordinary that deserved wider recognition. They asked Margaret if she would be comfortable with them sharing her story with the world, explaining that her example of community service could inspire others to make similar differences in their own neighborhoods. Margaret was hesitant at first, worried that publicity might change the natural, informal way she had been helping people. She expressed concern that media attention could make her neighbors uncomfortable or turn her genuine acts of service into something that felt artificial or forced. William and Kate understood her concerns and assured her that any sharing of her story would focus on the positive impact rather than seeking to exploit or sensationalize her work. They wanted to highlight the power of individual action and community spirit, not create a media circus that might disrupt the very community bonds that Margaret had worked so hard to build. After much discussion and with the support of her neighbors, Margaret agreed to let her story be told. The residents of Brookfield Estate gathered around as William and Kate explained their plan. They would share Margaret's story through official royal channels, but in a way that honored the dignity and privacy of everyone involved. The focus would be on celebrating community spirit and encouraging others to look for ways they could support people in their own neighborhoods. What happened next exceeded everyone's expectations. Kate used her personal social media account to share a heartfelt post about their visit, accompanied by photos that captured the warmth and genuine connections they had experienced. The post described Margaret's tireless work and the profound impact it had made on her community, but it also highlighted the broader message about how ordinary people could make extraordinary differences in the lives of others. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times, with people from across the country expressing their admiration for Margaret and sharing their own stories of community heroes in their neighborhoods. Comments poured in from people who had been inspired to start their own local support initiatives, and many others offered to send donations or assistance to Margaret's work in Brookfield Estate. By evening, major news outlets had picked up the story, but the coverage was different from typical royal news. Instead of focusing on fashion choices or protocol, journalists were drawn to the human interest elements of the story. They reported on Margaret's remarkable dedication to her community and the genuine, unscripted interactions that had taken place during the royal visit. The coverage sparked conversations about community support, social responsibility, and the power of individual action to address broader social challenges. Television news programs featured interviews with Margaret and several of her neighbors, allowing them to tell their stories in their own words. Margaret, despite her initial nervousness about being on television, spoke with quiet dignity about her work and the family she had been privileged to help. She emphasized that she was just one person doing what she could, and she encouraged viewers to look around their own communities to see where they might be able to make a difference. The neighbors who were interviewed shared powerful testimonials about how Margaret's help had changed their lives. Sarah, the young mother who had struggled with depression, explained how Margaret's support had given her the strength to rebuild her life and find stable employment. Frank talked about how Margaret's daily check-ins had helped him cope with his wife's illness and maintain hope during a frightening time. Marcus described how the after-school program had changed the trajectory of his education and his future prospects. These personal stories resonated deeply with viewers across the country. Many people recognized similar challenges in their own communities and began to see how individual actions could make meaningful differences. The coverage sparked a national conversation about community support, social isolation, and the role that ordinary citizens could play in addressing these issues. Meanwhile, back at Kensington Palace, William and Kate were monitoring the response to their visit and the subsequent media coverage. They were pleased to see that the focus remained on Margaret's work and the positive impact it had made, rather than on their own role in the story. The couple had hoped to shine a light on community service, and the overwhelming response suggested that Margaret's example was indeed inspiring others to take action. The palace received hundreds of letters and emails from people who had been moved by Margaret's story. Many shared their own experiences of helping neighbors or being helped during difficult times. Others asked for guidance on how they could start similar support networks in their own communities. The response demonstrated a deep hunger among the public for meaningful ways to connect with and support each other, particularly during challenging economic times. Local councils and charitable organizations across the country began reaching out to learn more about Margaret's approach and how it might be replicated in other areas. Social workers and community development professionals were particularly interested in the informal, grassroots nature of her work and how it had achieved such significant impact without formal funding or institutional support. Margaret's methods offered a model for community-based support that was both effective and sustainable. In Brookfield Estate itself, the attention had initially made some residents nervous about how their community would be portrayed in the media. However, as the coverage continued to focus on positive stories and genuine human connections, people began to feel proud of what their neighborhood represented. The visit had not only recognized Margaret's individual contributions, but had also celebrated the resilience and mutual support that characterized their community as a whole. The impact extended beyond media coverage and public recognition. Within days of the story breaking, donations began arriving at Margaret's door. People from across the country sent money, non-perishable food items, clothing, and other supplies that could be distributed to families in need. Local businesses offered to provide goods at reduced prices or to sponsor specific aspects of Margaret's work, such as the after-school program or the meal deliveries to elderly residents. Margaret was overwhelmed by the generosity and had to quickly organize a system for managing and distributing the donations fairly and efficiently. She enlisted the help of her neighbors to sort through items, maintain records, and ensure that resources reached the people who needed them most. This process actually strengthened the community bonds that had already been formed through Margaret's work, as more residents became actively involved in supporting their neighbors. The local school principal reached out to Margaret to explore ways the school could partner with her community programs. Teachers were interested in having students participate in service projects that would connect them with elderly residents and families in need. The partnership had the potential to benefit both the students, who would learn about community responsibility and service, and the residents who would receive additional support and intergenerational connections. As word of Margaret's work spread, other communities began organizing similar initiatives. Church groups, neighborhood associations, and informal networks of friends started their own versions of community support programs, often using Margaret's approach as a model. The emphasis was always on maintaining the personal, dignified character of the help being offered, ensuring that recipients felt valued and respected rather than pitted or patronized. William and Kate continued to follow the developments closely, occasionally checking in with Margaret and offering support for her expanding work. They were careful not to take credit for the movement that was growing around Margaret's example, instead consistently redirecting attention to the community members who were doing the actual work of caring for each other. The couple saw their role as amplifying voices and recognizing good work that was already happening, rather than creating or controlling community initiatives. The success of the Brookfield Estate story also influenced how William and Kate approached their other royal duties and public engagements. They began incorporating more unannounced visits and informal interactions into their schedule, looking for opportunities to connect with people who were making positive differences in their communities. This approach felt more authentic and meaningful than traditional ceremonial events, and allowed them to learn about and support grassroots efforts to address social challenges. The couple also began working with their staff to develop new ways of using their platform to highlight community heroes and successful local initiatives. They wanted to create a systematic approach to finding and celebrating people like Margaret, ensuring that recognition and support could be provided to community leaders who might otherwise remain invisible to the broader public. Public reaction to this shift in royal engagement was overwhelmingly positive. People appreciated seeing the royal family engaged with real issues affecting ordinary citizens, and the authentic nature of the interactions resonated strongly with the public. The traditional model of royal visits, with their formal protocols and staged interactions, began to seem less relevant compared to the genuine connections and meaningful conversations that characterize visits like the one to Brookfield Estate. The media also began to adapt their coverage of royal activities, recognizing that audiences were more interested in stories about community impact and human connection than in traditional royal protocol news. Journalists started looking for the deeper stories behind royal visits, exploring how these interactions might inspire positive action or bring attention to important social issues. The transformation was not limited to the United Kingdom. As news of Margaret's story spread internationally, people in other countries began sharing similar stories of community heroes in their own neighborhoods. Social media became a platform for celebrating everyday acts of kindness and service, with people using hashtags inspired by Margaret's example to share stories and encourage others to get involved in community support efforts. Margaret herself remained humble and focused on her work, despite the attention and recognition she was receiving. She continued her daily routine of checking on neighbors, delivering meals, and providing support to families in need. The additional resources that had become available through donations allowed her to expand her efforts, but she was careful to maintain the personal touch and individual attention that had made her work so effective. The long-term impact of the royal visit was becoming clear as communities across the country reported increases in volunteer activity, neighbor-to-neighbor support, and local charitable giving. Margaret's example had provided a tangible model for how individual action could address real needs and create positive change, inspiring people to look for ways they could make similar contributions in their own neighborhoods. Hashtag Prince William and Princess Kate's simple act sparks nationwide tears. Part 3 weeks after the initial visit to Brookfield Estate. The ripple effects of Margaret's story had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined. What began as a simple gesture of recognition had sparked a nationwide movement of community support and neighborly care that was transforming lives across the country. The story had touched something deep in the British consciousness, reminding people of values and connections that had perhaps been forgotten in the rush of modern life. William and Kate found themselves at the center of a phenomenon that was both inspiring and humbling. Their decision to visit Margaret had been motivated by a desire to recognize exceptional community service, but the response had revealed a widespread hunger for meaningful connection and purposeful action. Letters, emails, and social media messages continued to pour in from people who had been moved to start their own community initiatives or who wanted to share stories of local heroes in their neighborhoods. The palace staff had never handled anything quite like this before. Instead of managing traditional royal protocol and ceremonial events, they found themselves coordinating responses to hundreds of community groups seeking support and recognition. Royal communications teams were working with local media outlets to highlight community heroes across the country, and the couple's private secretaries were helping to identify and plan visits to other remarkable community initiatives that deserve national attention. Margaret, meanwhile, had become an unofficial spokesperson for grassroots community action. Despite her initial reluctance to be in the public eye, she had embraced the opportunity to advocate for community-based solutions to social challenges. Her natural warmth and genuine commitment made her a compelling voice for the movement that was growing around her example. She began accepting invitations to speak at community events, always emphasizing that anyone could make a difference, and that the most important work happened through individual acts of caring and connection. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the way communities across the country were organizing themselves. Neighborhood WhatsApp groups that had previously been used mainly for sharing minor complaints or organizing social events were becoming coordination centers for mutual support. People were organizing regular check-ins on elderly neighbors, setting up informal food banks, and creating networks for sharing resources and assistance during difficult times. In Birmingham, A group of university students had read about Margaret's after-school program and started a similar initiative in a housing estate near their campus. The students provided homework help and mentoring to local children while also learning about the challenges facing working families in their community. The program quickly expanded to include weekend activities and holiday clubs, creating lasting relationships between the students and the families they served. A retired teacher in Cornwall had been inspired by Margaret's approach to start a reading program for elderly residents in her area. She discovered that many older people were struggling with loneliness and isolation, particularly those who could no longer drive or easily leave their homes. Her weekly visits to read aloud and provide companionship had evolved into a network of volunteers who were providing various forms of support to elderly residents throughout the region. In Scotland, a group of mothers had organized a community kitchen that provided affordable meals for families struggling with the cost of living. The initiative had started with a few friends cooking extra portions and sharing them with neighbors, but it had grown into a sophisticated operation that was feeding dozens of families each week while maintaining dignity and community connections for everyone involved. These stories were being replicated across the country, each with local variations that reflected the specific needs and resources of different communities. The common thread was always the emphasis on personal relationships, dignity for recipients, and the belief that everyone had something valuable to contribute to their community's well-being. William and Kate began incorporating visits to these emerging community initiatives into their royal schedule, but they were careful to maintain the informal, genuine character that had made their original visit to Margaret so powerful. Instead of grand ceremonial events, they continued to make unannounced visits where they could have real conversations with people about their work and its impact. These visits were providing them with deep insights into the challenges facing communities across the country and the innovative ways that ordinary people were addressing those challenges. During a visit to the Birmingham University project, Kate spent time working directly with the children in the after-school program. She helped with homework, listened to young readers, and participated in art activities that the students had organized. The natural interactions and genuine connections that developed during these activities created moments of joy and inspiration for everyone involved. Kate later said that these interactions reminded her why she had been drawn to work with children and young people, and they reinforced her commitment to supporting community-based programs that were making real differences in young lives. William found himself particularly drawn to initiatives that were addressing social isolation among older people. During visits to programs inspired by Margaret's work, he spent time listening to elderly residents share their life stories and experiences. These conversations revealed the wealth of knowledge and wisdom that was often overlooked in society's focus on youth and innovation. William began advocating for intergenerational programs that could connect older and younger people in mutually beneficial relationships. The emotional impact of these visits was profound for everyone involved. Residents who had felt forgotten or overlooked by society found themselves valued and heard by people they had only seen in formal settings on television. The genuine interest and respect shown by William and Kate validated their experiences and contributions in ways that formal social services often couldn't match. Many people later described these interactions as life-changing moments that had restored their faith in human connection and social solidarity. The media coverage of these ongoing visits continued to focus on the positive impact and inspiring stories rather than on celebrity aspects of royal involvement. Journalists were discovering rich human interest stories in every community they visited, and the coverage was helping to spread awareness about both local initiatives and broader social issues. The reporting was contributing to a national conversation about community responsibility, social support, and the role that individual action could play in addressing collective challenges. Local government officials began taking notice of the movement that was growing around community-based support initiatives. Council members and social service administrators started reaching out to successful community programs to learn about their methods and explore ways that formal services could support rather than replace grassroots efforts. This collaboration between formal and informal support systems was creating more comprehensive and effective responses to community needs. The success of these initiatives was also attracting the attention of researchers and policy experts who were interested in understanding how community-based approaches could be scaled up and integrated into broader social policy. Universities began studying the methods and outcomes of programs inspired by Margaret's work, looking for lessons that could inform future approaches to community development and social support. Margaret herself had become a bridge between the grassroots movement and these more formal institutions. Her practical experience and deep understanding of community dynamics made her a valuable consultant for organizations seeking to develop more effective approaches to social support. She was frequently invited to speak at conferences and policy forums where she could share insights about what worked and what didn't in community-based programming. Despite the growing recognition and formal attention, Margaret remained focused on the day-to-day work of caring for her neighbors in Brookfield Estate. The additional resources and support that had become available through donations and partnerships had allowed her to expand her programs, but she was careful to maintain the personal relationships and individual attention that had made her work so effective. The challenge was scaling up impact while preserving the intimate, caring character that made the work meaningful for both volunteers and recipients. The anniversary of the original royal visit was approaching, and communities across the country were planning celebrations and recognition events for the local heroes who had emerged in response to Margaret's example. These events were focusing on storytelling and connection rather than formal ceremonies, creating opportunities for people to share how community support had impacted their lives and to strengthen the networks of care that had developed over the past year. William and Kate were planning to return to Brookfield Estate for the anniversary, but this time they would be joined by representatives from many of the communities that had been inspired by Margaret's example. The gathering would provide an opportunity to celebrate the growth of the movement and to share lessons learned from different approaches to community support. More importantly, it would reconnect the growing network of community leaders and volunteers, creating opportunities for continued learning and collaboration. The transformation that had begun with a simple royal visit had evolved into something much larger and more significant than anyone had anticipated. What started as recognition for one remarkable woman's service to her community had become a national movement that was changing how people thought about their responsibilities to each other and their communities. The story was far from over, and the full impact of Margaret's example was still being felt as more communities discovered the power of grassroots action and mutual support. The success of the initiative was also beginning to influence government policy and funding decisions. Politicians were taking note of the effectiveness and popular support for community-based programs, and new funding streams were being developed to support grassroots initiatives while allowing them to maintain their independence and community-driven character. This represented a significant shift in how social policy was being conceived and implemented, with greater recognition of the value of bottom-up approaches to addressing social challenges. Hashtag Prince William and Princess Kate's simple act sparks nationwide tears. Part 4. 1 year after their first visit to Brookfield Estate, William and Kate returned to find a community transformed beyond recognition. The quiet street where they had first met Margaret was now buzzing with activity, but not the chaos of media attention or tourist curiosity. Instead, it was alive with the energy of a community that had discovered its own power to create positive change and support its members through both challenges and celebrations. Margaret's small house had become the unofficial headquarters for what was now known as the Brookfield Community Network, a sophisticated yet informal system of mutual support that had expanded far beyond the original food deliveries and check-ins. The red door that had welcomed the royal couple a year earlier now bore a small plaque designating it as a community support hub, recognizing its role as a center for neighborhood care and connection. The anniversary celebration was unlike any royal event in recent memory. Instead of formal ceremonies and staged interactions, William and Kate found themselves part of a genuine community gathering where their presence was welcome, but not central to the proceedings. Residents had organized a street party that showcased the many ways their community had grown and developed over the past year, with displays of artwork created by children in the after-school program, performances by a choir that had formed among the elderly residents, and presentations about various initiatives that had emerged from Margaret's original work. The transformation was evident in both large and small details. The community garden that had been started on a vacant lot was now producing vegetables that supplemented the food pantry supplies. A tool library had been established in someone's garage, allowing neighbors to share equipment and skills for home repairs and improvements. A childcare cooperative had formed among working mothers, providing flexible support for families with irregular schedules. Each initiative had grown organically from identified needs and available resources, demonstrating the community's capacity for innovation and self-organization. Margaret, now recognized as a national figure for community service, had somehow managed to maintain her focus on individual relationships and personal connections despite the broader attention her work had received. She moved through the anniversary celebration with the same gentle presence that had characterized her work from the beginning, checking on specific people, making sure everyone felt included, and quietly coordinating the many volunteers who had joined her efforts over the past year. The statistics were impressive. Over the course of the year, the Brookfield Community Network had provided regular meal support to more than 60 families, offered after-school programming to 45 children, conducted daily check-ins with 37 elderly residents, and facilitated countless informal acts of mutual support among neighbors. But Margaret and her fellow volunteers knew that numbers could never capture the true impact of their work, which was measured in restored hope, strengthened relationships, and renewed sense of community belonging. William and Kate spent the day moving through different areas of the celebration, but their interactions maintained the same authentic, unscripted character that had made their original visit so powerful. They participated in community activities rather than observing them, helped serve food at the street party, listened to children read stories they had written, and engaged in meaningful conversations with residents about how their lives had changed over the past year. One of the most moving moments came when Sarah, the young mother who had credited Margaret with saving her life, introduced William and Kate to her new partner and announced that she had recently been promoted to a supervisory position at her job. Sarah's transformation from someone struggling with depression and poverty to a confident, thriving community member exemplified the kind of change that was happening throughout the network. Her story illustrated how individual support could create opportunities for people to rebuild their lives and contribute to their community's well-being. Marcus, the teenager who had benefited from the after-school program, was now in his first year at university studying social work, with plans to return to his community after graduation to expand the youth programming. His academic success was remarkable, but equally important was his commitment to giving back and his understanding of how community support had made his achievements possible. Marcus had become a role model for younger children in the program, demonstrating that education and opportunity were achievable goals even for young people facing significant challenges. Frank, the elderly man whose wife had been seriously ill during the original royal visit, had become one of the most active volunteers in the network despite his own advanced age. His wife had recovered significantly, and both of them had found renewed purpose in supporting other families facing health crises. Frank had organized a support group for caregivers that met weekly in the community center, providing both practical advice and emotional support for people dealing with the stress of caring for seriously ill family members. These individual success stories were powerful, but the broader transformation of the community was even more significant. Brookfield Estate had evolved from a neighborhood where people knew each other casually to a genuine community where residents were actively invested in each other's well-being. The social isolation that had characterized many people's lives before Margaret's work began had been replaced by a web of connections and support that provided both practical assistance and emotional sustenance. The anniversary celebration also featured representatives from the hundreds of communities across the country that had started their own initiatives inspired by Margaret's example. These community leaders had come to share their experiences, learn from each other, and celebrate the national movement that had grown from one woman's quiet service to her neighbors. The gathering provided an opportunity for networking and collaboration that strengthened the broader movement while honoring its grassroots origins. William and Kate used the anniversary occasion to announce a new royal initiative that would provide ongoing support for community-based programs without interfering with their local character or independence. The program would offer small grants, training opportunities, and networking support to help community groups develop their capacity while maintaining their volunteer-driven, neighbor-to-neighbor approach. The initiative was designed to amplify and support existing community energy rather than creating new institutional structures that might diminish the personal relationships that made these programs effective. The announcement was received with enthusiasm by community leaders who had often struggled to access resources and support for their work. Many grassroots initiatives operated on minimal budgets with volunteer labor, limiting their ability to expand their impact even when demand for their services was high. The new Royal program would provide flexible support that could help address these practical challenges while preserving the informal, community-driven character that made the program successful. Media coverage of the anniversary celebration continued the pattern that had been established with the original visit, focusing on community impact and human stories rather than celebrity aspects of royal involvement. Journalists reported on the practical outcomes of various community initiatives, the personal transformations of residents like Sarah and Marcus, and the broader lessons that could be learned from the Brookfield estate experience. The coverage reinforced the message that ordinary people could create extraordinary change in their communities through sustained commitment and collaborative effort. The success of the Brookfield model was now being studied by researchers and policy experts around the world. Universities were sending teams to document the methods and outcomes of the community network, and government agencies were exploring how similar approaches might be supported and replicated in other areas. International delegations were visiting to learn about the British experience with community-based social support, and Margaret found herself advising organizations in other countries that wanted to develop similar initiatives. Despite the growing attention and formal recognition, the core values and methods that had made Margaret's work successful remained unchanged. The emphasis was still on individual relationships, personal dignity, and community ownership of solutions. The expansion and formalization of support had been carefully managed to preserve these essential characteristics while providing the resources needed for sustainable growth and broader impact. As the anniversary celebration concluded, William and Kate reflected on how their simple decision to visit Margaret had led to this remarkable transformation. They had hoped to recognize exceptional community service, but they had inadvertently catalyzed a movement that was changing how people across the country thought about their responsibilities to each other and their communities. The experience had also transformed their own approach to royal service, demonstrating the power of authentic engagement and genuine relationships to create positive change. Margaret, as she cleaned up after the celebration with the help of dozens of volunteers, remained focused on the daily work that had started everything. Tomorrow, she would resume her routine of checking on neighbors, coordinating support for families in need, and maintaining the personal connections that kept the community network strong. The recognition and resources were welcome, but the heart of the work remained the same. One person caring for another, one family supporting another, one community taking responsibility for the well-being of all its members. The story of Margaret and Brookfield Estate had become a powerful example of how individual action could create ripple effects that transformed entire communities and inspired nationwide change. The simple act of recognizing and celebrating community service had revealed the deep human desire for connection, purpose, and mutual support that existed across all social and economic boundaries. The movement that had grown from Margaret's example was continuing to evolve and expand, touching lives and creating positive change in ways that would be felt for generations to come. The legacy of that first royal visit was now measured not just in the lives changed in one small community, but in the thousands of communities across the country where neighbors were caring for each other with renewed commitment and effectiveness. Margaret's quiet service had shown that extraordinary change was possible through ordinary actions, and that message was continuing to inspire people to discover their own capacity for making a difference in the lives of others.